Hi, I'm Ashton Bishop. My father-in-law threw my wedding ring across his marble floor and told me to crawl for it like the beggar I was. His wife laughed while begging me to sign papers I hadn't read. They didn't know I'd just discovered the truth buried in their lawyers' files. They didn't know their entire fortune, the hotels, the vineyards, the legacy they flaunted at every family dinner was never theirs to control. It was mine, left to me by the woman they claimed to honor but secretly betrayed. But the worst part? It wasn't the insult. It wasn't even the years of humiliation. It was realizing they'd spent a decade trying to break me because they knew. They always knew. And they were terrified. So I stayed quiet, let them think they'd won, and watched their world crumble from the inside. Now I wonder if they regret laughing. Do you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air in Bellport carried the scent of salt and old money. I stood outside the Sentinel Trust building, a towering glass structure that reflected the gray October sky like a mirror. 23 years had passed since I first walked through these doors, back when I was trying to secure a small business loan for my graphic design startup. I remembered wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, carrying a folder of sketches and projections that the loan officer barely glanced at before shaking his head. Today was different. Everything about me was different. The suit I wore was tailored, understated charcoal gray that spoke without shouting. My shoes were polished but not flashy. I'd learned over the years that real power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, waiting for the right moment to reveal its presence. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the marble lobby. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning. Welcome to Sentinel Trust. How may I help you?" I pulled out my identification and placed it on the counter. "Ashton Bishop. I have an appointment with Edmund Castellano." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. She glanced at the name, then at me, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Yes, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Castellano is expecting you. Please take the executive elevator to the 19th floor." Edmund Castellano, my father-in-law, the man who had spent the better part of a decade reminding me, in ways both subtle and brutal, that I would never be good enough for his precious world. He'd made it clear from the moment I married his daughter that I was an outsider, a mistake she'd made in a moment of rebellion that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to correct. The elevator climbed silently. I watched the numbers tick upward and thought about the last family dinner 3 weeks ago. Edmund had raised his wine glass, expensive burgundy that probably cost more than my first car, and made a toast. "To family," he'd said, his eyes sliding past me like I was part of the furniture, "to those who belong." Everyone had laughed. Even my wife, Grace, had smiled into her napkin, though her hand had found mine under the table and squeezed, a silent apology that somehow made it worse. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with dark wood panels and muted lighting. Through the glass walls of the conference room at the end of the corridor, I could see them. Edmund stood near the windows, his silver hair perfectly styled, talking to his attorney. His wife, Vivienne, sat in one of the leather chairs, scrolling through her phone with the bored elegance of someone who'd never worried about money a day in her life. And there, sitting across from them, looking small and uncomfortable, were my own parents. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected this. My parents, who lived 2 hours away in a modest suburban home, who I saw maybe twice a year for holidays, sitting in Edmund Castellano's conference room like supplicants at court. I walked toward the glass doors, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. Edmund's voice carried through the partially open door. "Well, look who decided to show up. Still playing businessman, Ashton?" I stepped inside without responding. My father glanced up, offering a weak smile before looking away. My mother twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. "What are they doing here?" I asked, my voice level. Edmund's smile was sharp. "Your parents came to me for advice, financial advice. It seems they've gotten themselves into a bit of trouble with some unfortunate investments." He paused, letting the words sink in. I told them I might be able to help, as a courtesy to family, of course. The way he said family made it clear he didn't include me in that definition. I turned to my parents. "Dad, what's going on?" My father opened his mouth, but Vivienne cut in, her voice honeyed and venomous at once. "Oh, Ashton, don't be dramatic. Edmund is simply trying to help. You know how generous he is, though I suppose you wouldn't understand that, given your background." My background. The words hung in the air like smoke. My background of working 3 jobs to put myself through design school. My background of building a business from nothing, of late nights and rejected proposals and slow, grinding progress that never seemed fast enough for people like them. I reached into my coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was thick, cream-colored paper with an embossed seal I'd come to know well over the past month. I placed it on the conference table between us. "I'm not here for family therapy," I said quietly. "I'm here for clarification on estate documents." Edmund's eyes narrowed. He didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, he walked to his desk and opened the top drawer. What he pulled out made my breath catch in my throat. It was my wedding ring. The simple gold band Grace had slipped onto my finger 8 years ago in a courthouse ceremony that her parents had refused to attend. I'd lost it 6 months ago, or so I'd thought. Grace and I had torn apart our apartment looking for it. She'd cried, apologized, promised we'd get a replacement. But here it was, in Edmund's hand. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly so everyone could see. Then, without warning, he tossed it onto the marble floor. The ring hit with a sharp, metallic clink and rolled in a lazy circle before settling near my feet. "Pick it up," Edmund said, his voice loud enough to carry through the glass walls into the hallway beyond. "Go on, crawl for it like the beggar you are. Like you've always been." The room went still. Through the glass I could see people stopping in the hallway, looking in. Edmund's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Vivienne watched with cold amusement. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, but she didn't speak. My father stared at the table. No one defended me. No one said a word. I looked down at the ring, then back at Edmund. Something old and wounded inside me wanted to shout, to flip the table, to finally release years of swallowed insults and casual cruelty. But I'd learned something important in the past month, something that changed everything. "I'm not here for your approval, Edmund," I said softly. "I'm here to inform you that as of this morning, I've been granted full access to the Castellano Estate Trust documents. All of them." His face flickered, just for a moment, confusion, then calculation. I bent down slowly and picked up my wedding ring. I didn't put it on. I simply held it in my palm, feeling its weight, and then I slipped it into my pocket. "You should read the envelope," I said, turning toward the door. "Wait." Edmund's voice had lost some of its confidence. "What are you talking about? What documents?" I paused at the threshold and looked back. "The ones your mother-in-law left. The ones that were sealed for 10 years. The seal expired last month." Vivienne stood abruptly, her phone clattering to the table. "That's impossible. Mother's will was settled years ago." The will was, I agreed, but not the trust directive, not the codicil she filed 3 weeks before she died. I watched the color drain from Edmund's face, watched Vivienne grip the back of her chair for support. My parents looked between us, confused, irrelevant to whatever was unfolding. I stepped into the hallway and started walking. Behind me, I heard the envelope tear open, heard the rustle of papers, and then, cutting through the silence like a blade, Edmund's voice, sharp with panic. "This can't be legal." But it was. And he knew it. The coffee shop 3 blocks from Sentinel Trust was quiet at this hour. Most of the morning rush had cleared, leaving behind the lingering smell of espresso and the soft murmur of a few remote workers tapping at laptops. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the street, watching my hands stop shaking. It had been 8 years since I'd married Grace Castellano, but the story really started long before that. I'd met her at a design conference in Portland. She was there representing her family's hospitality business, scouting new branding concepts for a boutique hotel chain they were launching. I was there with my portfolio, hoping to land even one client who'd take a chance on an independent designer with more ambition than credentials. We'd talked for 3 hours in the hotel bar. She'd laughed at my terrible jokes and listened, really listened, when I explained my vision for work that meant something beyond just pretty logos. By the end of the night, she'd hired me for a small project. By the end of the month, we were inseparable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd known she came from money. That much was obvious from the way she moved through the world, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to check a bank balance before buying groceries. But I didn't understand the full scope of it until she took me home to meet her parents. The Castellano estate sat on 40 acres just outside Bellport, a sprawling property that included the main house, a guest house, vineyards, and a private lake. The main house itself looked like something out of a European postcard, all stone and glass and architectural ambition. Edmund had met us at the door. He'd shaken my hand with the grip of someone testing strength, his eyes scanning me like a contract he was looking for loopholes in. "So you're the designer," he'd said, making the words sound like an insult. Vivienne had been worse. She'd smiled, offered wine, asked polite questions about my family, my education, my plans. Every question was a trap designed to highlight exactly how different my world was from theirs. "Your parents, what do they do?" "My dad's a retired postal worker. My mom was a teacher." "How nice. And where did you say you went to school?" "State University. I worked full-time and took classes at night." "How industrious." The word industrious had carried all the warmth of a winter funeral. Grace had squeezed my hand under the table, but I'd seen the way she'd looked at her mother, seeking approval that never came. The worst moment that first visit had been dinner. We'd sat at a table that could have seated 20. Just the four of us scattered at one end like actors on an empty stage. Edmund had talked about the family business, about legacy, about the importance of understanding where you came from. Grace's great-grandmother started our hospitality empire with a single boarding house in 1947, he'd said, swirling his wine. She built it with nothing but determination and vision. It's been passed down through the women in our family ever since. Grace will inherit it all someday, of course. He'd looked at me when he said that last part, making sure I understood. This wasn't my world. It would never be my world. I was a tourist at best, a threat at worst. But then there had been Eleanor, Grace's grandmother. Eleanor Castellano had been 83 that first visit, sharp as broken glass despite her age. She'd watched the whole dinner in silence, observing with eyes that missed nothing. Afterward, she'd asked to speak with me alone on the terrace. "Walk with me," she'd said, not a request. We'd walked through the gardens as the sun set, the air cooling, crickets beginning their evening song. She'd asked about my work, my ideas, my plans. She hadn't asked about my parents, professions, or my bank account. She'd asked what I believed in. "I believe in building things that matter," I'd told her, "not just for clients, but for communities. Design that serves people, not just profit." She'd stopped walking and looked at me for a long moment. "My husband was like you," she'd said finally. "Came from nothing, built everything." Edmund never understood that. He inherited ambition but not hunger. She'd smiled, sad and knowing. "Be careful, Ashton. Hungry people make them nervous." I hadn't understood what she'd meant then. I'd been too young, too optimistic, too certain that love and hard work could bridge any gap. Grace and I had married quietly 6 months later. Her parents hadn't come to the courthouse. They'd sent a card with a check and a note that said, "We hope you'll be very happy." The check had bounced. The years that followed had been a careful dance. I'd built my business slowly, deliberately, refusing Edmund's occasional offers of contracts that came with strings attached. Grace had worked alongside me, using her hospitality background to help land clients, to bridge the gap between my creative vision and the corporate world's expectations. We'd been happy. Not wealthy, not comfortable by Castellano standards, but happy. Eleanor had visited us once in our small apartment in the city. She'd walked through our mismatched furniture and stacks of design portfolios with genuine interest, asking questions, offering advice. Before she'd left, she'd hugged me, held on longer than necessary. "Keep building," she'd whispered. "Don't let them convince you you're small." 3 months later, she'd died. Stroke, sudden and complete. The funeral had been massive. Hundreds of people I'd never seen, all talking about legacy and loss and the empire she'd built. I'd stood at the back with Grace, holding her while she cried, feeling like an outsider at my own grandmother-in-law's goodbye. The will reading had been brief. Everything had gone to Edmund and Vivienne, with trust funds established for Grace and her siblings. Standard, expected, clean. I hadn't questioned it. It wasn't my place. But Eleanor had left something else, something no one had known about. A sealed directive with her attorney, with instructions that it remains sealed for exactly 10 years after her death. A directive that named me, specifically me, as the trustee and beneficiary of the true Castellano legacy, the hotels, the vineyards, the accounts that predated Edmund's involvement, everything that Eleanor herself had built, not inherited. She'd left it to me because she'd known. She'd known what Edmund and Vivienne were, what they'd become. She'd known they'd try to erase me, to push me out, to make sure Grace understood that marrying beneath herself came with consequences. And she'd left me the tools to fight back, not for revenge, but for protection, for dignity. I discovered the directive 1 month ago, when Eleanor's attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, had contacted me out of nowhere with a meeting request marked urgent and confidential. She'd handed me a folder an inch thick and told me to read carefully. Mrs. Castellano was very specific, Margaret had said. She wanted you to have time to grieve, to build your own life, to prove yourself on your own terms before you knew. 10 years. That was her timeline. I'd read the documents 3 times that first night, unable to believe what I was seeing. Eleanor had restructured the entire estate trust 8 months before her death, quietly, legally, irreversibly. She'd moved the core assets into a separate trust that bypassed Edmund entirely, naming me as the executor upon the seal's expiration. Edmund had been managing property he didn't actually own for a decade, living in a house that wasn't his. Making decisions about a business he had no legal right to control. And he'd had no idea. Neither had I, until now. My coffee had gone cold. I checked my phone. 17 missed calls. 12 from Grace. 3 from my mother. 2 from Edmund's attorney. I silenced the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Outside, the street hummed with ordinary life. People walking dogs, hailing cabs, buying flowers from the corner stand. None of them knew that 3 blocks away a man's entire world had just collapsed. None of them would care. I stood, left cash on the table, and walked out into the October afternoon. The sky had cleared slightly, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. I had one more stop to make before I went home. I needed to see the property. The one Eleanor had written about in her private letter. The one she'd said held the truth about everything. The drive to Huntley Ridge took 40 minutes through winding back roads that cut through hills covered in trees just beginning to turn. I'd only been out here once before, years ago, when Eleanor had insisted on showing Grace and me something she'd called her first love. At the time, I'd thought she'd meant the scenic overlook where she and her husband had gotten engaged. I'd been wrong. The property sat at the end of a gravel drive, hidden behind a stone wall that had mostly crumbled with age. The gate was open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. I pulled through and followed the drive until it opened into a clearing. There it was, the original Castellano property, not the mansion in Bellport, not the showpiece estate with its manicured lawns and imported sculptures. This was where Eleanor had started. A modest inn, 2 stories, cedar shingle siding weathered to gray. Wrap-around porch sagging slightly on one end. Behind it, I could see the remains of what had once been guest cottages, most of them overtaken by vines and time. I parked and got out. The air here was different, quieter, heavier, with the scent of wet leaves and old wood. I walked up the porch steps, testing each board before putting my full weight down. The front door was locked, but Margaret had given me the key. It turned roughly in the old mechanism, and the door swung inward with a groan. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. Dust hung in the shafts of light that cut through the gaps in the boarded windows. The lobby was small, intimate, with a stone fireplace along one wall and built-in shelving that still held a few forgotten books, their spines faded beyond reading. I walked through slowly, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. The dining room still had tables, chairs stacked against the walls. The kitchen beyond was outdated but intact, a massive cast-iron stove dominating one corner. Upstairs, I found 8 guest rooms, each one simple but thoughtfully designed. Wide windows that would have flooded the rooms with morning light. Built-in window seats. Small details that spoke of care, of someone who'd built this place not for profit but for welcome. In the last room at the end of the hall, I found what Margaret had told me to look for. A small writing desk positioned beneath the window, and inside its drawer a leather journal, the cover embossed with Eleanor's initials. I sat on the dusty floor, opened the journal, and began to read. The entries started in 1965, when Eleanor had been 32 years old. She wrote about buying the property with money she'd saved from working as a hotel manager in the city. About the risks, the doubts, the excitement of creating something entirely her own. "Richard thinks I'm crazy," she'd written in March of that year. "Maybe I am. But I look at this place and I see possibility. I see a refuge. Somewhere people can come and feel safe, feel seen. That matters more than profit." The entries continued, documenting the renovation, the opening, the first guests. Her writing was warm, detailed, full of life. She'd described families who'd returned year after year, couples who'd gotten engaged on the property, strangers who'd become friends over breakfast in the dining room. Then, about 60 pages in, the tone shifted. The entry was dated 1973. "Edmund wants me to sell. He's been talking to developers, people who want to tear this down and build condominiums. He says the property is wasted on nostalgia, that I could make 10 times what the inn brings in. He doesn't understand. Or worse, he does and doesn't care. This place isn't about money. It never was." I flipped ahead. More entries about Edmund's pressure, about arguments with Vivienne, who'd sided with her son, about feeling outnumbered in her own family. Then, an entry from 1979, "I've decided, when I'm gone, this all goes to someone who understands. Not what I built, but why. Someone who builds for meaning, not just profit. Someone who knows what it's like to create from nothing and protect it from people who only see dollar signs." I closed the journal and sat in the fading light. Eleanor had written those words 30 years before I'd even met Grace, but somehow, she'd known. She'd known exactly the kind of person Edmund would become, the kind of pressure he'd put on anyone who threatened his control. And she'd planned accordingly. The directive, the sealed trust, the 10-year wait, all of it had been designed to protect her real legacy from the people who'd tried to profit from it without understanding it. My phone buzzed. "Grace." I hesitated, then answered. "Ashton, where are you?" Her voice was tight, worried. "I'm at Huntley Ridge." Silence. Then, softer, "The old inn?" "Yeah." "My father is losing his mind. He's saying you've stolen documents, that you're trying to defraud the family. He's talking about lawyers, about pressing charges." She paused. "What's happening? What were those papers?" I stood, walked to the window. Through the trees, I could see the sun beginning to set, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. "Your grandmother left me something," I said finally. "Something your father didn't know about. Something he's been managing for 10 years without legal authority." "What are you talking about?" "The estate, Grace. The real estate. The hotels, the accounts, the property, everything Eleanor built herself. She put it in a separate trust. She named me executor." The silence stretched so long, I thought she'd hung up. "Grace? Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why would she do that?" "Because she knew your father would destroy it. Turn it into profit margins and quarterly reports. She wanted someone who'd protect what she'd actually built, not just the money it generated. And she chose you." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite acceptance either. She chose someone who understood building from nothing, someone who wouldn't be blinded by inheritance. Another long pause. I heard voices in the background, Edmund's raised in anger. "I have to go," Grace said. "Just please, come home, we'll figure this out." The line went dead. I stood in the empty inn, surrounded by the ghost of Eleanor's dream, and wondered if figuring it out was even possible, or if some things, once broken, stayed that way. I locked the door behind me and drove back toward the city as darkness fell, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. The quiet part was over. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to a hotel on the outskirts of Bellport, a mid-range chain with clean rooms and no questions asked. I needed space to think, to process what was coming. Grace had sent 3 more texts, each one more urgent than the last, but I couldn't face her yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was walking into. The hotel room was generic, sterile in its sameness. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the folder Margaret had given me. Inside were copies of everything: the original trust directive, Eleanor's handwritten instructions, the property deeds, the account statements. Numbers that made my head spin. Eleanor hadn't just left me the inn at Huntley Ridge. She'd left me controlling interest in 17 properties across 3 states, including the flagship Castellano Hotel in downtown Bellport, the crown jewel Edmund had been using as his personal monument for the past decade. There was also a letter, sealed in a separate envelope with my name written in Eleanor's careful script. I'd been too overwhelmed to open it at Margaret's office. Now, alone in this anonymous room, I carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, expensive, the kind Eleanor had always preferred for important correspondence. Her handwriting filled both sides in neat, measured lines. "My dear Ashton," it began, "if you're reading this, then 10 years have passed since I left this world, and you've finally learned the truth I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I imagine you're confused, perhaps angry that I kept this from you. But I need you to understand why I did what I did." She went on to explain how she'd watched Edmund transform over the years, how the boy who'd once helped her clean guest rooms had become a man obsessed with appearance over substance, with profit over purpose. How Vivienne had encouraged those worst tendencies, seeing the family business as a social ladder rather than a legacy of service. I knew that if I left everything to Edmund directly, he would sell it all within 5 years, turn my life's work into a line item on some corporation's balance sheet. I couldn't bear that thought. But I also knew that if I tried to bypass him while I was alive, he would fight it, contest it, drag the family through legal battles that would tear everyone apart. She wrote about watching me with Grace, about seeing something in me that reminded her of her younger self and her late husband. "You build with your hands and your heart, Ashton. You understand that real value isn't measured in quarterly reports. That's why I chose you, not to punish Edmund, but to protect what I built from becoming something unrecognizable." The letter ended with a simple instruction: don't let them bully you into giving this up. Stand firm. You're stronger than you think, and you have every legal right to what I've given you. Use it wisely. Use it well. Make me proud. I folded the letter carefully and sat in the silence. Outside, I could hear the muffled sounds of the highway, the distant wail of a siren. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Ashton, what the hell is going on? Edmund called us. He's saying you've done something terrible. He wants us to talk sense into you." Of course he did. Edmund had always been good at recruiting allies, at making himself the victim of other people's unreasonableness. "Dad, I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me. Edmund doesn't have all the facts. He says you're trying to steal the family business. He says Grace is devastated." That last part hit harder than I wanted to admit. Grace will understand once I explain, but I need to handle this my way. "Your way," my father repeated, and I could hear the doubt in his voice. The same doubt I'd heard my whole life when I'd told him I was skipping the stable career path for design work. "Just don't do anything stupid, son." I hung up without promising anything. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in Edmund's conference room. The ring hitting the marble floor. My parents sitting silent while he humiliated me. The casual cruelty in Vivienne's voice. By morning, I'd made my decision. If Edmund wanted a war, I'd give him clarity instead. Not violence, not revenge, just the simple, undeniable truth. I showered, put on the same suit from yesterday, and drove to Sentinel Trust. It was barely 8 in the morning, but I knew Edmund would be there. He was always there early, a habit he wore like a badge of honor, proof of his dedication and work ethic. The lobby was quieter than yesterday, just a few early employees grabbing coffee from the cafe in the corner. I walked past the reception desk without stopping. The same woman from yesterday looked up, startled. "Mr. Bishop, I don't think—" "It's fine," I said, not breaking stride. "He's expecting me." That was a lie, but she didn't stop me. The elevator ride to the 19th floor felt longer this time, each floor a countdown to confrontation. When the doors opened, I could see through the glass walls that Edmund was already in his office, on the phone, gesturing emphatically. I walked down the hallway and pushed open his door without knocking. He looked up, surprised, then angry. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, slamming it down. "You have some nerve showing your face here after yesterday. I've already contacted my attorneys. You're going to regret." I pulled out my phone and placed it on his desk. On the screen was a single contact, Margaret Chen, Eleanor's attorney. My finger hovered over the call button. "Before you finish that threat," I said calmly, "I need you to understand something. Everything you've managed for the past 10 years, the properties, the accounts, the business decisions, all of it was done without legal authority. Eleanor restructured the trust 8 months before she died. You've been operating a business you don't own. His face went red. That's insane. The will was clear. The will was clear, I interrupted. But the trust directive supersedes it. Margaret has all the documentation, court certified, notarized, legally binding. Do you want me to call her now, or do you want to read the copies I brought? I pulled the folder from my coat and dropped it on his desk. He stared at it like it might explode. This is some kind of fraud, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. You've forged documents, I've done nothing but receive what was legally left to me. You can call Margaret yourself. Better yet, call your own attorney and have them review it. Every signature, every filing, every page is authentic. He grabbed the folder with shaking hands and started flipping through it. I watched his face change as he read, watched the arrogance drain away and get replaced with something closer to panic. His eyes moved faster, scanning, searching for some loophole, some mistake. There wasn't one. Eleanor had been thorough. This can't be, he muttered. Mother wouldn't. She would never. She would, I said quietly, and she did. Behind him, the door opened. Vivian walked in, dressed in her usual armor of designer clothes and expensive jewelry. She froze when she saw me. What is he doing here? Edmund, I thought you were handling this. Edmund didn't answer. He just handed her the folder with trembling hands. She read in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to cold fury. You manipulated her, she said finally, looking at me with pure venom. A dying old woman, and you manipulated her into this. I met Eleanor twice while she was alive, I said. Once at your house, once at my apartment. Both times with Grace present. I had no idea she'd done any of this until last month. She made these decisions on her own, for her own reasons. We'll fight this, Vivian said. We have resources, real attorneys, not some. Then fight it, I said. Take it to court. Spend years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to overturn a legal trust that was properly filed and executed. Meanwhile, I'll be managing the properties, making decisions, operating the business exactly as Eleanor intended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Edmund slumped in his chair, the folder sliding from his hands onto the desk. Vivienne stood rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped her purse. I picked up my phone. I'm having a meeting with all property managers tomorrow at 10 at the Huntley Ridge location. You're welcome to attend, but understand that you'll be attending as former managers, not owners. I'd appreciate your cooperation during the transition, but I don't require it. I walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Edmund had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Vivienne looked like she wanted to throw something. For what it's worth, I said, Eleanor didn't do this to hurt you. She did it to protect what she'd built. If you'd ever understood the difference between owning something and honoring it, maybe things would have turned out differently. I left before either of them could respond. In the hallway, I could see faces pressed against glass walls, employees who'd heard raised voices and were pretending not to listen. Let them look. Let them talk. The truth was out now, and there was no putting it back. I took the elevator down and walked out into the morning sun. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. I'd expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, something big and satisfying. Instead, I just felt tired and certain. The hard part wasn't over, but the first battle was. I'd stood my ground without shouting, without begging, without crawling for anything. Eleanor would have been proud. Grace was waiting when I got home. She sat on our couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, eyes red from crying. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, but a kind of exhausted resignation. Your phone's been off, she said quietly. I needed time to think. My father called me 17 times last night. My mother showed up at 3 a.m. crying. They're saying you've stolen everything, that you've destroyed the family. She paused, wiping her eyes. And I don't know what to believe anymore. I sat down across from her, careful to leave space between us. What did they tell you? That my grandmother left you the business in some secret trust. That you've known about it for weeks and didn't tell me. That you went to the office yesterday specifically to humiliate my father in front of everyone. Her voice cracked. Is any of that true? Some of it, I admitted. I found out about the trust a month ago. Margaret Chen, your grandmother's attorney, contacted me. She gave me documents that showed Eleanor had restructured everything before she died. She left me control of the core estate, the property she built herself, not the parts your father expanded or acquired. Grace stared at me. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how, because I was still trying to understand it myself, because I knew it would tear your family apart and I didn't want to be the one to detonate that bomb. But you did it anyway, yesterday at the bank. Yesterday your father threw my wedding ring on the floor and told me to crawl for it, in front of my parents, in front of his staff. He called me a beggar, Grace. And you know what? No one said anything. Not my parents, not his attorney, not you when I told you about it later. No one thought that was worth defending. She flinched. I wasn't there. But you knew. I told you last month about him losing my ring at the estate. You knew he had it. You knew he was planning something. Silence filled the room. Outside, I could hear children playing in the courtyard, their laughter distant and surreal against the weight of what we were discussing. I didn't know it would be like that, Grace said finally. I thought maybe he'd give it back, make some speech about family. I didn't think he'd... She stopped, unable to finish. I pulled Eleanor's letter from my jacket pocket and handed it to her. Your grandmother wrote this. It was sealed with the trust documents. I think you should read it. Grace took the letter with shaking hands. I watched her face as she read, saw the tears start halfway through, saw her expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that looked like grief. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it on the coffee table between us. She never told me any of this. She never said she was disappointed in my father, that she thought he'd... Her voice broke. I thought she was proud of him, of us, of what we'd built. She was proud of what she built, I said gently. That's different from being proud of what happened to it after. Grace stood abruptly and walked to the window. She stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I remember being 8 years old, visiting the inn at Huntley Ridge. Grandma Eleanor took me there one summer, just the two of us. We stayed in one of the cottages, and she taught me how to make the beds the way she used to do when she first started. Hospital corners, she called them. She said every guest deserved to feel like someone had taken care in preparing their room. She turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. My father wanted to bulldoze that place when I was 15. He had investors lined up, architects with plans for luxury condos. Grandma Eleanor refused. They had this huge fight at Thanksgiving. He told her she was being sentimental and foolish, that she was holding the family back from real wealth. I stood and moved toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping me. She died 6 months later, Grace continued. And at the funeral, my father gave this beautiful eulogy about honoring her legacy, about building on the foundation she'd created. Everyone cried. Everyone talked about what a devoted son he was. She laughed bitterly. 2 weeks later, he put the Huntley Ridge property up for sale. He told me it was what Grandma would have wanted, that he was freeing up capital to expand the business. I believed him. Grace. He sold it to a development company that sat on it for 10 years waiting for permits. They were going to start demolition next spring. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes. You stopped that. The trust documents Margaret showed you, they pulled the property out of that sale, didn't they? I nodded. Eleanor made sure Huntley Ridge was protected, along with 3 other original properties. Your father never had the legal right to sell any of them. Grace sank back onto the couch, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. I sat beside her this time, close enough to touch but not touching, not sure if I had the right anymore. I don't know who my family is, she said through her hands. I thought I did. I thought my father was difficult but ultimately good. I thought my mother was shallow but harmless. I thought my grandmother loved all of us equally. She lowered her hands. But she didn't, did she? She saw something in them I was too close to see. She loved you, I said firmly. Nothing in those documents suggests otherwise. She left you trust funds, property, everything a grandmother would want for her granddaughter. She just didn't want your father controlling it all. There's a difference. But she left the core business to you, her real legacy. She trusted you more than her own blood. The words hung between us, painful and true. I didn't know how to soften them, so I didn't try. What happens now? Grace asked. Do you take over everything? Do we move into the estate? Do we... She stopped. Do we survive this? That question hit harder than anything Edmund had thrown at me. I reached for her hand. She let me take it, but didn't squeeze back. I don't want the estate, I said. I don't want your father's office or his title or any of the things he thinks I'm trying to steal. I want to honor what Eleanor built. Restore the properties she cared about. Run them the way she would have wanted, focused on service and community, not just profit margins. And I want you with me, if you can be. If I can be, she repeated hollowly. My father will never forgive this. My mother already called me this morning, crying, saying I need to choose, them or you. Like it's that simple. Is it? I asked quietly. She pulled her hand away and stood again, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. I don't know anything anymore. Yesterday I woke up thinking the biggest problem in my life was whether we could afford to fix the air conditioning. Today I'm finding out my dead grandmother thought my father was destroying her legacy, that she trusted my husband more than her own son, that everything I thought I knew about my family was a carefully constructed lie. Her voice rose with each word until she was almost shouting. Then, just as suddenly, she deflated. I need time. I need to think. Okay, I said. I'm going to stay with my friend Autumn for a few days. Not with my parents, she added quickly. I can't face them right now, but I can't be here either. I can't look at you without seeing my grandmother's letter, without wondering how long you've been planning this. I wasn't planning anything. I know. Logically, I know that. But it doesn't change how it feels. She grabbed her purse and a jacket from the closet. At the door, she paused. I love you, Ashton. I want you to know that, but I don't know if love is enough to survive this. Then she was gone. The apartment fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I sat on the couch, Eleanor's letter still on the coffee table, and felt the full weight of what I'd unleashed. I'd won the battle with Edmund. I'd secured the legal rights Eleanor wanted me to have. But in doing so, I might have lost the only thing that actually mattered. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Chen with a single-line message followed by an attachment. You should see this. It was in Eleanor's safety deposit box, marked for your eyes only after the trust activated. I opened the attachment with shaking hands. It was a photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed the inn at Huntley Ridge in its prime, the gardens blooming, guests on the porch. And there, standing by the front door with a broom in hand and a smile on her face, was a young Eleanor. She couldn't have been more than 30, her whole life ahead of her. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Eleanor's hand, "The day I stopped being afraid of what people thought I should build. The day I started building what mattered. May you have the same courage." I stared at that photograph for a long time, at Eleanor's smile, at the inn she'd built from nothing and protected until her death. And I understood, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't about money or property or winning some decades-long chess game. It was about having the courage to protect something worth protecting, even when everyone else told you to let it go, even when it cost you everything. I stood up, wiped my eyes, and began making a list. Tomorrow's meeting at Huntley Ridge would be the first step, not toward revenge or triumph, but toward restoration. Toward honoring the woman who'd seen something in me worth investing in, even when her own family couldn't. Eleanor had given me more than a business. She'd given me a second chance to prove that some things mattered more than approval, more than comfort, more than keeping the peace. And I wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, I met Philip Rousseau at a diner 20 minutes outside Bellport. Philip was someone I'd known since my early design days, back when we'd both been scraping for clients and living off ramen and ambition. While I'd gone into branding and design, Philip had found his calling in forensic accounting, the kind of work that involved spreadsheets, subpoenas, and following money trails that people desperately wanted to stay hidden. He was already in a corner booth when I arrived, nursing black coffee and reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when I slid into the seat across from him, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting. "Thanks. You always know what to say." He smirked slightly, but didn't push. "You said on the phone you needed someone to look at financial records. Estate-related. That's not usually your kind of problem." I pulled out a flash drive and set it on the table between us. My grandmother-in-law left me control of her estate trust. The family's been managing it for 10 years, thinking they owned it. I need to know what they've actually been doing with it. Philip picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. And you think they've been doing something wrong? I know they've been doing something wrong. I just don't know the full extent of it. He plugged the drive into his tablet and started scrolling. I'd spent most of last night organizing the files Margaret had given me. Bank statements, property records, transaction histories, contracts, everything Eleanor's trust had generated over the past decade. To my untrained eye, it had looked like a lot of activity, buying and selling, investments, expenditures. But I didn't have Philip's gift for seeing patterns in chaos. He scrolled in silence for several minutes, his expression growing more focused. Finally, he looked up. How much do you actually know about what Edmund's been doing? I know he's been living in the estate house and managing the properties. Beyond that, not much. Philip tapped a few keys, pulling up a spreadsheet. Okay, let's start with the obvious stuff. The Castellano Hotel downtown, the flagship property. According to these records, it's been operating at a loss for the past 6 years. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. It's always busy. Every time I've driven past, the parking lot's full. Exactly. So either they're running the worst hotel in history, or someone's cooking the books. He pulled up another screen. Look at these expense reports. Monthly consulting fees to something called Vivienne Associates LLC, which is, surprise, your mother-in-law's personal consulting company. She's been billing the hotel $75,000 a month for interior design consultation. $75,000 a month? Every month for 6 years. That's over $5 million for consultation on a property that hasn't been renovated once in that time period. He scrolled further. And it gets better. There's a property management company called Castellano Oversight Group that's been taking a 20% cut of all rental income from the vineyard properties. Want to guess who owns Castellano Oversight Group? Edmund. Bingo. He's been paying himself to manage properties he doesn't actually own, then declaring those payments as business expenses to reduce the trust's taxable income. Philip leaned back, shaking his head. This is either incredibly stupid or incredibly bold. I'm not sure which. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How much are we talking about total? Philip worked through several screens, his fingers moving quickly over the tablet. Conservatively? Between the fake consulting fees, the property management overcharges, and what looks like straight-up embezzlement from petty cash accounts, I'd estimate somewhere between $8 and $12 million over the past decade. The number hit me like a physical blow. $8 to $12 million, siphoned from Eleanor's life's work to fund Edmund and Vivienne's lifestyle. The European vacations, the art collection, the luxury cars, all of it paid for with money that wasn't theirs. Can we prove it? I asked. In court? Absolutely. These aren't sophisticated schemes. They're barely disguised. It's like they thought no one would ever look closely because they were family. He paused. Or because they thought they actually owned everything and it wouldn't matter. What about the property sales? Grace mentioned her father tried to sell the Huntley Ridge Inn. Philip pulled up another set of documents. He didn't just try, he completed the sale. Or at least he thought he did. In 2019, he sold the property to Summit Ridge Development for $2 million. The money went into an account controlled by Edmund, and it's been spent, most of it on personal expenses, some on investments that haven't performed well. But Eleanor's trust protected that property. How did he sell something he didn't own? He forged trust authorization documents. Look here. Philip showed me a signature page. This document allegedly authorizes the sale and is signed by you as the trust executor. Except it's dated 6 months before you actually became executor, and that's definitely not your signature. I stared at the forged document. Someone had taken the time to fake my signature, to create paperwork that would make an illegal sale look legitimate. The casual criminality of it was stunning. There's more, Philip said, his tone darker now. 3 other properties have similar sale paperwork in process, the Vineyard in Oakmont, the Bed and Breakfast in Harwick, and a commercial building downtown. None of them are complete yet, but the preliminary documents are all there, all with forged authorization, all moving money into accounts Edmund controls. He's been systematically looting the trust, I said slowly. Yes, and documenting it beautifully for us in the process. Philip closed the tablet. The question is, what do you want to do about it? You could go to the police right now with this. Forgery, embezzlement, fraud. He's looking at serious prison time if you press charges. I sat back, my mind racing. Prison time for Edmund. Financial ruin for Vivienne. The entire family destroyed, Grace caught in the middle, forced to watch her parents face criminal charges because of documents I'd brought to light. I need to think about it, I said finally. Philip nodded. Fair enough, but don't think too long. Some of these property sales are scheduled to close in the next 60 days. If you don't stop them now, recovering that money later will be a nightmare. We finished our coffee in relative silence. Philip copied all his findings onto a separate drive for me and promised to prepare a formal report if I needed it for legal proceedings. As we stood to leave, he put a hand on my shoulder. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you're in this position. Family stuff is always messy, but your grandmother-in-law was right to trust you with this. Someone needed to stop them. I drove back toward the city, Philip's words echoing in my head. Someone needed to stop them. But at what cost? If I went to the police, Edmund would likely claim he'd made honest mistakes, that he'd believed he had authorization, that any errors were unintentional. With good lawyers, he might avoid prison, but the scandal would still destroy him, destroy Vivienne, and by extension, devastate Grace. On the other hand, if I did nothing, Edmund would continue stealing from Eleanor's legacy until there was nothing left to protect. The properties would be sold off. The money would disappear into offshore accounts and bad investments, and everything Eleanor had built would vanish, like it had never existed. My phone rang. Margaret Chen. Ashton, we have a problem. Edmund's attorneys have filed an emergency motion to freeze the trust assets, pending a competency review of Eleanor's mental state when she created the directive. Can they do that? They can try. It's a desperate move. But if they can convince a judge that Eleanor wasn't of sound mind when she restructured the trust, they might be able to invalidate it. At minimum, they'll tie everything up in court for months or years. I pulled over into a parking lot, my hands shaking on the wheel. What do we need to counter it? Evidence that Eleanor was competent, medical records, witness testimony, contemporaneous documents showing clear thinking. Do you have access to anything like that? I thought about the journal at Huntley Ridge. Eleanor's clear, methodical entries spanning decades. I thought about her letters, carefully planned and precisely executed. I have her journals, personal writings that show clear cognition right up until her death. That'll help. I'll need copies. We have a hearing scheduled for Friday morning. Can you get them to me by tomorrow? I'll drive to Huntley Ridge today. After we hung up, I sat in the parked car, watching traffic flow past. Everything was accelerating now, spiraling towards some confrontation I couldn't avoid. Edmund wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. He was going to fight with everything he had, and he had resources, lawyers, connections, decades of reputation built on Eleanor's foundation. All I had was the truth, and Eleanor's belief that sometimes that was enough. I started the car and headed toward Huntley Ridge. If Edmund wanted a war over Eleanor's competency, I'd give him documentation of a mind sharper than his had ever been. Every journal entry, every business decision, every carefully planned step she'd taken to protect her legacy from the people who would have destroyed it. Eleanor had spent the last years of her life preparing for this fight. The least I could do was finish it for her. Huntley Ridge looked different in daylight. Less haunted. More simply abandoned. I parked in the gravel lot and sat for a moment, looking at the weathered cedar shingles and sagging porch. This was where it had all started, where Eleanor had built something from nothing and proven it could be done. This was what Edmund wanted to erase, to turn into luxury condos and profit margins. Not anymore. I grabbed an empty box from my trunk and headed inside. The journal I'd found yesterday was just the beginning. Margaret had mentioned Eleanor kept meticulous records, and if they were anywhere, they'd be here at the property she'd loved most. The office was on the first floor, tucked behind what had once been the reception desk. The door stuck when I tried to open it, swollen from humidity and age. I put my shoulder into it, and it gave way with a groan. Inside was exactly what I'd hoped to find. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Guest records 1965 to 1975. Property maintenance 1976 to 1985. Financial statements 1986 to 1995. She'd kept everything, organized chronologically, preserved like artifacts in a museum to her own careful mind. I started with the most recent cabinet, the one labeled Personal Correspondence 2010 to 2015. Inside were folders of letters, emails printed and filed, notes from meetings. I pulled files at random and started reading. A letter from 2012, Eleanor writing to her attorney about concerns that Edmund was overextending the business with risky investments. He sees the properties as assets to leverage, not legacies to maintain. I fear what will happen when I'm no longer here to provide balance. An email from 2014, Eleanor declining to co-sign on a loan. Edmund wanted to expand the hotel chain into 3 new cities. The expansion isn't sustainable. We built slowly for a reason. Fast growth means cutting corners, and cut corners mean losing what made us special in the first place. A note from 2015, handwritten on her personal stationery, met with Margaret today to discuss trust restructuring. It breaks my heart to bypass Edmund, but I see no other way to protect what we built. He's become everything Richard and I promised we'd never be. More concerned with appearance than substance. I pray I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Each document was dated, signed, witnessed when appropriate. Each one showed a mind working clearly, thinking strategically, making difficult decisions with full awareness of their implications. This wasn't the work of someone incompetent or confused. This was someone who'd seen a problem coming years in advance, and had taken methodical steps to address it. I loaded box after box into my car. File folders, bound journals, ledgers showing Eleanor's personal tracking of business expenses that often didn't match the official reports Edmund filed. She'd been documenting his behavior for years, maybe not knowing exactly how she'd use the information, but keeping it nonetheless. In the bottom drawer of her desk, I found something else. A videotape, the old VHS kind, in a case labeled simply, "For Ashton, if needed." My hands shook as I pulled it out. Eleanor had died in 2015, back when people still occasionally used physical media. She'd recorded this, knowing I might need it someday, knowing Edmund might challenge her competency. I didn't have a VHS player in my car or at home. Those were relics of a different era. But I knew someone who might. My parents, who'd never thrown anything away and whose basement was a museum of outdated technology. The drive to their house took 40 minutes. I hadn't called ahead, hadn't warned them I was coming. When my mother opened the door, her expression was guarded, worried. "Ashton, we weren't expecting you. I need to use your VHS player, the one in the basement. It's important." She hesitated, glancing back into the house where I could hear my father watching television. "Your father's upset with you. Edmund called again this morning, said you're refusing to be reasonable." "Mom, I don't have time to explain everything right now, but I promise you Edmund is not the victim here. Can I please just use the player?" Something in my tone must have convinced her. She stepped aside and let me in. The basement was exactly as I remembered, cluttered with old furniture and boxes of memories no one could quite throw away. The TV and VHS player sat in the corner, dusty but presumably functional. I plugged everything in and inserted the tape. Static filled the screen for a moment, then cleared to show Eleanor sitting in what looked like Margaret's law office. The timestamp in the corner read March 2015, 2 months before she died. "My name is Eleanor Rose Castellano," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I'm recording this statement of my own free will, in the presence of my attorney Margaret Chen, to document my mental capacity and explain my decisions regarding my estate." For the next 40 minutes, Eleanor methodically walked through her reasoning. She discussed specific business decisions Edmund had made that concerned her, citing dates, numbers, meetings. She explained her decision to restructure the trust, naming me specifically and outlining why she believed I would honor her vision better than her own son. "Ashton Bishop married my granddaughter 8 years ago," she said, looking directly into the camera. "In that time, I've watched him build a business based on service and integrity. He reminds me of my late husband, Richard, who understood that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives you touch and the legacy you leave. My son Edmund has lost sight of that, if he ever truly understood it. This isn't about punishment, it's about preservation." She went on to discuss her medical condition, acknowledging recent health concerns but providing documentation from her doctors confirming full cognitive function. She cited the results of mental competency tests, memory assessments, everything that would counter any claim that she'd been confused or manipulated. At the end, she looked tired but resolute. If Edmund challenges this, as I suspect he will, I want it known that every decision I've made has been with full awareness and clear purpose. I'm not a victim. I'm a woman protecting what she built from people who would destroy it for profit. I hope Ashton has the strength to see this through. I believe he does. The screen went to static. I sat in the dim basement, tears running down my face, and felt the full weight of Eleanor's faith in me. She'd known exactly what would happen, had prepared for every challenge Edmund might throw, and had trusted me to stand firm when the time came. My mother's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Ashton, is everything all right?" I wiped my eyes and ejected the tape. "Yeah, Mom, everything's all right." I found her in the kitchen, making tea she probably thought I needed. I sat at the table while she worked, the same table where I'd done homework as a kid, where we'd had countless dinners before I'd left for college, and then for a life she'd never quite understood. "That woman on the tape," she said softly. "That was Grace's grandmother?" "Yes." She seemed very certain, very clear. Mom set a cup in front of me. "Edmund told us you'd manipulated her, taken advantage of an old woman. But that's not what I just saw." "No, it's not." She sat down across from me, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "Your father and we've been talking. About yesterday at the bank. About how Edmund treated you." She paused, choosing words carefully. "We should have said something. We should have stood up for you." "Yes," I said quietly, "you should have." "We were intimidated, I think. Edmund has always been so confident, so successful. We felt like we needed his help, like we couldn't afford to offend him. But watching you pick up that ring, watching him humiliate you while we sat silent, that wasn't right. That wasn't how we raised you to treat people." It was the closest to an apology I was likely to get, and it mattered more than I'd expected. "Thank you for saying that." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I take this tape and about 20 boxes of documents to Eleanor's attorney. We go to court on Friday and prove that Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. And then I start the hard work of actually managing what she left me, of proving I deserve the trust she placed in me." My mother nodded slowly. "Your father won't like it. He's already committed to Edmund's version of events, but I'll talk to him, try to help him understand." I finished my tea and stood. "I need to go. I have a lot to prepare before Friday." At the door, my mother hugged me, quick and tight. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I should have said it more often, but I'm proud of who you've become. I drove back to Bellport with the tape carefully secured in its case, the boxes of Eleanor's records filling my trunk and back seat. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. By Friday, one way or another, this phase of the battle would be over. Either Eleanor's wishes would stand, or Edmund would succeed in erasing them. Either I'd prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in me, or I'd fail her memory in the most public way possible. But as I drove through the gathering dusk, I felt something I hadn't felt in days, not confidence exactly, but clarity. Eleanor had given me everything I needed to fight this battle. All I had to do was show up and tell the truth. Sometimes, that was the hardest part, but it was also the only part that really mattered. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that matched the weight in my chest. I dressed carefully in a navy suit, white shirt, subdued tie, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money or power. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, someone who'd worked for everything they had and wasn't trying to be anything more. The courthouse in downtown Bellport was an imposing structure, all marble columns and brass fixtures that had witnessed decades of disputes being settled under the weight of law. Margaret met me on the steps, her expression calm but focused. "Ready?" she asked. I held up the briefcase containing Eleanor's tape, her journals, and Philip's financial analysis. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good. Remember, let me do most of the talking. You're here to be credible and honest. Don't let Edmund's attorneys bait you into anger. That's what they'll try to do." We walked through security and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hearing was being held in a smaller courtroom, not the grand theatrical spaces you see in movies, but a functional room with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly harsh. Edmund was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table with two attorneys in expensive suits. Vivienne sat in the front row behind him, wearing black like she was attending a funeral. When they saw me enter, Edmund's jaw tightened. Vivienne looked away. Grace wasn't there. I'd texted her that morning letting her know about the hearing, but she hadn't responded. I didn't know if she was avoiding the situation entirely, or if she'd chosen a side that wasn't mine. The not knowing hurt worse than any definitive answer would have. Judge Patricia Whitmore entered, and we all stood. She was in her early 60s, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had heard every excuse and believed none of them. She sat, reviewed the papers in front of her, and looked up. This is an emergency motion filed by Edmund Castellano seeking to freeze the assets of the Eleanor Castellano Trust and requesting a posthumous competency evaluation. Ms. Chen, you're representing the trust and its current executor Ashton Bishop. Mr. Castellano is represented by Hoffman and Associates. Let's begin. Edmund's lead attorney, a man named Vincent Hoffman with silver hair and a voice like smooth whiskey, stood first. Your Honor, this case represents a tragic situation where an elderly woman was manipulated in her final years into making decisions that contradicted her lifelong wishes and values. Eleanor Castellano built a hospitality empire over 6 decades, always with the intention that it would remain in family hands, specifically passing to her son Edmund, who had managed the business alongside her for 30 years. He gestured toward Edmund, who sat with his hands folded, trying to project wounded dignity. Then, in the final 8 months of her life suffering from various health complications, Mrs. Castellano was convinced to completely restructure her estate, bypassing her devoted son in favor of her granddaughter's husband, a man she'd only met twice and who had no experience in hospitality management. The timing is suspicious. The decision is irrational. And the result is that a lifetime of careful planning has been undone, likely through undue influence at a time when Mrs. Castellano was most vulnerable. Hoffman pulled up medical records on a screen. These documents show that Mrs. Castellano was diagnosed with hypertension, early-stage kidney disease, and had suffered several small strokes in the 18 months before her death. She was on multiple medications, some of which have documented cognitive side effects. It is our position that she was not of sound mind when she made these dramatic changes, and therefore the trust restructuring should be invalidated. He sat down looking satisfied. It was a compelling narrative if you didn't know the full story. Vulnerable old woman, predatory in-law, a family torn apart by greed. The judge's expression remained neutral, but I could see her making notes. Margaret stood, and the room seemed to shift slightly. Her presence was different from Hoffman's smooth performance. More direct, more grounded. Your Honor, the narrative we just heard is emotionally compelling but factually incorrect. Eleanor Castellano was many things, but vulnerable was never one of them. She was a businesswoman who built an empire through careful planning and clear-eyed assessment of people and situations. That clarity didn't abandon her in her final years. If anything, it sharpened. Margaret pulled out Eleanor's journals and placed them on the evidence table. These are Mrs. Castellano's personal business journals, spanning from 1965 until 2 weeks before her death. Every entry is dated, detailed, and demonstrates a mind that was not only functional but exceptionally sharp. She documented concerns about her son's management style, his financial decisions, his priorities. These weren't sudden concerns. They developed over years, maybe decades. She opened one journal to a marked page. Here's an entry from 2008, 7 years before her death. Mrs. Castellano writes, Edmund told me today that the Hunley Ridge property is a sentimental waste of resources. He wants to sell it to developers. I told him no, and he became angry, accused me of holding the family back. He doesn't understand that some things matter more than profit. I worry what will happen when I'm no longer here to protect what we built. Margaret looked up at the judge. That's not cognitive decline. That's a grandmother watching her son lose sight of what matters and trying to find a way to protect her legacy from him. Hoffman stood. Objection, Your Honor. These journals are self-serving documents that could have been altered. They're notarized, Margaret interrupted. Every 6 months, Mrs. Castellano had her attorney witness and notarize select entries as part of her estate planning. The dates, the handwriting, the notarizations, all verifiable and consistent. This isn't a case of manipulated evidence. This is a woman documenting her own competent decision-making process. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Ms. Chen, the medical records Mr. Hoffman presented do show health complications. How do you address that? By presenting Mrs. Castellano's own words, Your Honor. Margaret nodded to me, and I pulled out the VHS tape. We have a video statement recorded 2 months before her death, in the presence of her attorney, where Mrs. Castellano explicitly addresses these exact concerns. The bailiff set up an old television and VHS player, equipment that looked almost comically outdated in the modern courtroom, but when Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, sharp and clear and undeniably present, the room went silent. We watched the entire 40-minute statement, Eleanor walking through her reasoning, citing specific incidents, explaining her decisions with a clarity that made Hoffman's claims of incompetence seem absurd. When she got to the part about me, I felt Edmund's eyes burning into the back of my head. Ashton Bishop understands something my son has forgotten, Eleanor said from the screen, that our business was never about the buildings or the bank accounts. It was about creating spaces where people felt welcomed, valued, seen. That was the vision Richard and I started with, and it's the vision I want to preserve. Ashton has that same philosophy in his own work. I've watched him turn down lucrative contracts because they didn't align with his values. That's the kind of person I want protecting what I built. The tape ended. Judge Whitmore sat back, tapping her pen against her notepad. Mr. Hoffman, your response? Hoffman stood, but he'd lost some of his earlier confidence. Your Honor, this video doesn't change the fact that Mr. Bishop had minimal contact with Mrs. Castellano and stands to gain millions. Actually, Margaret interrupted again, let's address that claim. Mr. Bishop, would you please stand? I stood, my heart pounding. Margaret gestured for me to approach the witness stand. After being sworn in, she asked me directly, how many times did you meet Eleanor Castellano in person? Twice. Once at a family dinner when Grace and I were first dating, and once when she visited our apartment about a year before she died. Did you ever discuss her estate, her will, or her business holdings with her? Never. Not once. Did you know she had restructured her trust in your favor? Not until her attorney contacted me last month, 4 weeks ago. Margaret turned to the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Bishop had no knowledge of Mrs. Castellano's plans, made no requests, applied no pressure. He was as surprised as anyone when he learned about the trust. The only manipulation here is the narrative Mr. Hoffman is trying to create. She pulled out another document. Furthermore, we have evidence that while Mrs. Castellano was supposedly incompetent and vulnerable, Mr. Edmund Castellano was systematically embezzling from the trust, consulting fees paid to shell companies, forged authorization documents, property sales that violated trust terms. We have documentation of over $10 million in fraudulent transactions. The courtroom erupted. Edmund stood, shouting, That's a lie! Those were legitimate business expenses. Sit down, Mr. Castellano, Judge Whitmore said sharply. Mr. Hoffman, did you know about these allegations? Hoffman looked genuinely shocked. No, Your Honor, this is the first I'm hearing. Then perhaps you should have investigated your client's activities before accusing others of impropriety. She turned to Margaret. I assume you have documentation? Extensive documentation. Prepared by a forensic accountant and ready for immediate review. Margaret placed Philip's report on the evidence table. We're prepared to file criminal charges if necessary, but we hoped this hearing would resolve the civil matters first. Edmund had gone pale. Vivienne was whispering frantically to him, but he seemed unable to respond. I watched him from the witness stand. This man who'd thrown my wedding ring on the floor, who'd called me a beggar, who'd spent a decade stealing from a woman who'd trusted him. Judge Whitmore spent several minutes reviewing the documents, her expression growing harder with each page. Finally, she looked up. I've seen enough. The evidence overwhelmingly supports that Eleanor Castellano was of sound mind when she restructured her trust. Her reasoning was clear, documented, and consistent over time. The video statement alone would be sufficient, but combined with years of journal entries and contemporaneous medical evaluations showing full cognitive function, there's simply no basis for this competency challenge. She turned to Edmund. Furthermore, Mr. Castellano, the allegations of financial impropriety are extremely serious. I'm ordering a full forensic audit of all trust transactions during the period you had management authority. If criminal activity is confirmed, I will refer this matter to the district attorney's office. Hoffman tried to speak. Your Honor, if we could have time to review. Your time is up, Mr. Hoffman. The emergency motion is denied. The The trust restructuring stands as valid and legally binding. Mr. Bishop remains as executor with full authority. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. Then Edmund stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking. "You've stolen everything, destroyed this family." "I have stolen nothing," I said quietly. "Your mother left me what she wanted to leave me. The only person who destroyed anything here is you." Vivienne grabbed Edmund's arm, pulling him toward the exit. They left without another word, Hoffman trailing behind them, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The courtroom slowly emptied until it was just Margaret and me. "Well," she said with a small smile, "that went better than I expected." I sat down heavily on the nearest bench, the adrenaline draining out of me all at once. "Is it really over? The legal part, I mean?" "The competency challenge is over. Edmund can't contest the trust restructuring now. But the financial crimes investigation is just beginning. That could take months, maybe years to fully resolve." She sat beside me. "The question is, what do you want to do? You could push for criminal prosecution, or you could settle this privately." I thought about Grace, about my marriage hanging by a thread, about Eleanor's real goal, which had never been about punishing Edmund, but about protecting what she'd built. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "I need to talk to Grace first." Margaret nodded, gathering her files. "Take your time. You've earned it. Eleanor would be proud of how you handled yourself today." I walked out of the courthouse into the gray afternoon. The air felt lighter somehow, cleaner. I'd stood my ground without compromising who I was. I'd honored Eleanor's trust without becoming the villain Edmund tried to paint me as. Now came the harder part, figuring out if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage, and whether the victory I'd just won had cost me everything that actually mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.